Oh my god, we're talking about topicality. So, let's start off by talking about topicality. So first things first, even though most of you are beyond this in theory, what are the four parts of topicality? Amaya.
The interpretation.
Okay, the interp.
The violation. The standards.
Okay.
And the voters.
Violation, standards, voters. Okay, what else can we call standards?
Reasons to prefer.
Reasons to prefer, okay, because the reasons to prefer our interpretation. So, let's answer a different question, which is, generally speaking, what is the function of topicality? What is topicality doing?
It's testing if the affirmative is in correlation with the topic.
What does that mean?
Topical?
Well, sure, I mean,
You're saying they're being abusive with the topic, they're wrong.
what does it mean for a team to be abusive? What makes something abusive?
If the affirmative is defending something that's not.
What do you mean something?
If the plain text isn't topical.
They can take advantage about whatever they want though, right? So it's not just something. Tio says the plain text. When we say, like, this team's untopical, and we say, as you said, that they're abusing us or whatever, or their abuse is happening, what do we mean by abuse?
Isn't somebody defending the status quo or subsuming their ground?
No, because extra topical affirmatives don't defend the status quo, but they're not topical.
Stealing ground from that negative case.
Okay,
It's not
we're getting closer. So and Michelle says stealing ground from the negative case. That's what it means to have abuse, which is 50% right.
It's not fair.
Kind of 100% right. But the word I want to focus in on is ground. Okay? So let's go back to my question. What is the function of topicality? Generally speaking, most people, what do they think the function of topicality is? Topicality is about establishing the division of ground for a topic / debate, but let's say topic for now. This is what topicality is. Topicality is where we try and establish who gets what ground. Now that's a very important concept to understand because almost all of you, probably based on the way you were explaining topicality to me, think of topicality as purely a question of what can the AF do and what can't the AF do. But the question isn't so much specifically what limit can we put upon the affirmative in a vacuum, independent of everything else. The question of topicality is what ground is entitled to the negative versus what ground is entitled to the affirmative. Why is it a problem for them not to be topical? Because they are taking ground that belongs to the negative, or they are taking ground that is not sort of in their territory. They've gone beyond it. Why is extra topicality bad? Same reason. They have defended the ground they were entitled to and some more. But the crucial thing you have to understand in debate is the affirmative gets their plan and the negative gets everything else. There is no negative resolution in debate. The negative does not have to prove some statement is true. The affirmative must prove the resolution is true, theoretically. In 50% of high-level debates, that's not the case. But in theory, the affirmative has to prove the resolution is true. The negative just has to refute, rejoinder, the affirmative. So the question becomes, what is the division of ground? How can we know what the affirmative was entitled to versus what the negative was entitled to? And that comes back to the word that we were discussing for a while, which is abuse. So given this definition here, what does abuse mean?
Unfair division of ground.
Okay, it means unfair is the word you use. We could say fair, fair is fine, maybe unequitable, whatever. unfair / I don't know, inappropriate, I guess is how I'll define it for now, just to stay away from like voter terms. Inappropriate, and God, I sure hope inappropriate has 2 N's right there. That seems wrong. Is that right?
No, it doesn't.
It's not 2 N's, that's stupid. Anyway,
No, it is.
is it 2 N's?
It's 2 P's and then another P.
I knew there was a double somewhere. Appropriate division of ground. Okay? And as I said, there's kind of 2 ways that can happen. What are the 2 ways that can happen? The AF increases their ground in some way beyond what they should have been entitled to, or the AF does what?
Takes the negatives.
They decrease the negatives ground. Now, what does that look like? When the negative is arguing that the affirmative has decreased their ground, how do they typically demonstrate that in a debate?
Can't read it this out.
Okay, we couldn't read our dissat. You no-linked our dissat. The dissat didn't make sense anymore because of the ground that you took. Okay. There are 2 kinds of abuse. What are the 2 kinds of abuse in debate?
Proven
Proven and
and potential.
potential. So let's stick with that. Proven and potential. So, what is proven abuse? What does it mean to have proven abuse?
They actually
did it.
used the grounds that they took.
Mm-hmm. The AF took our ground or increased theirs. Whereas potential abuse is their inter justifies taking our ground or increasing theirs. All right. So this is like very basics. Topicality establishes the division of ground in the debate. What ground belongs to which team? And the idea, ostensibly, is that there should be a somewhat equitable division of ground, or at least there is a division of ground, whether it's equitable or not, that a topic entitles people to, which is what we're going to be talking about a little bit later, the difference between those 2 ideas. We read topicality because of abuse. Because either, in fact, they have taken our ground, they have increased their ground unfairly, they have circumvented education on specific ground, or, in practice, they could do that based on their inter, and that is a sufficient reason to drop them. So which one do you think judges prefer? Judges want you to have potential abuse or proven abuse?
Proven abuse.
Proven abuse. Almost, I don't know any judge who's like, I prefer potential abuse to proven abuse. I know about 8 out of 10 judges who say things like, I will not vote unless you have proven abuse. And there are some judges, not even some, I'm going to say in our circuit, 20% of judges who just won't vote on topicality. Even if the other team is like factually stealing your ground, cheating essentially, they're just like, I don't like theory debate, whatever. Okay? So, almost always a non-starter unless we're in front of the most technical of judges who are friendly to tea. But sometimes in these debates, we have to have a debate about potential versus proven abuse. Because we only have that side of it, right? We don't have proven abuse. We have to go for potential abuse. So how do people argue potential abuse is sufficient, potential abuse matters? What are some arguments you think we could make that say, like, look, I know you like proven abuse, and obviously if we had that, we sure would have read it, but here's why potential abuse, from like an impact calculus, impact weighing perspective, is a sufficient reason to drop the other team.
limits?
There's one, give me 1 second. There's one bad argument people make for this, which I think I included in my notes, and one good argument which I did not include in my notes. So Michelle, you said limits, tell me about that?
That they need to be limited in their interpretation.
Sure, but like how does that, why is potential versus proven factor into that?
Because the whole point of the resolution is to be on topic. And
Okay.
even if they're plain text.
Even if they were too dumb to steal the ground that they
Yeah.
could have stolen, like it's still bad enough, right? Okay, May, what are your thoughts?
No, yeah, that's.
Okay, so what's the bad one? The bad one that used to get made, which was silly, was like potential abuse outweighs proven abuse because it's infinite in probability and magnitude, right? There's an infinite number of ways they could have potentially abused us, and like that's sufficient to outweigh, right? Even if they didn't literally do it, all the possibilities where they could have are sufficiently bad. That's a pretty bad argument, right? Because I think that gets responded to by the thing we say fairly regularly, like when we're explaining proven versus potential abuse. Like it's like voting us down on a potential disad. You're right, there's 1,000 potential disads you could have read in this debate. You probably should have read one of them. I don't know why you didn't. The only somewhat reasonable explanation of this is about LOC strategy, okay? Because we're talking about Parley, obviously. LOC strategy. Here's the thing. If you're a good team, some of us are. If you're a good team, when you're doing prep for the negative, what does that look like? Like literally, like what do you do in prep for the negative? Okay, you said DAs and T. What if you were better than you are? DAKT, right? And when you're the LOC, the person who actually has to read the strategy, and you go into the room, you have these DAs that are sick or whatever, you know, but it's questionable whether they link, that influences your strategy. With the premise here being that, like, sure, they didn't literally no link our disad, but I had to make decisions in the LOC about what we're gonna read in this debate, and that was constrained by this thing. Sure, I didn't literally sit there and read a disad that doesn't link for 2 minutes, but it did influence the way that we had to approach our ground and blah, 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 blah. We think we're entitled to that. Now again, are you gonna win on potential abuse? No. 99% of the time, no. Can you win on it? Absolutely. So I just want to make sure you were aware of this general concept. I'm going to keep just establishing the division of ground for a topic on the board. Are there any questions about these things before I move on to the next step? Okay. So then the question becomes, in practice rather than in theory, how does topicality break out on like an actual debatey type level? What are the arguments that the AF is making in general, and what are the arguments that the negative is making in general? And we're going to focus on this level because the vast majority of the actual debate on topicality takes place at the standards level and nowhere else. Okay? When you get better, a lot of it moves to the impact level, but when you're not very good, it's almost all standards. So, what, generally speaking, is the AF trying to say? What do their standards tend to look like? What, generally speaking, is the affirmative trying to say? And how do those things pertain to topicality being a question of establishing the division of ground for both sides on a topic? What does the negative say? What does the AF say?
Creativity.
So the AF says something like creativity. I think there's a better way of saying that, but we can put creativity on the board for now. And what's the premise of a creativity standard?
Is it,
Do whatever. Allow them to do different kinds of apps, so they don't have to be straight at the same one.
Why is it good
specificity?
Breadth
Education.
over depth.
of what?
Education.
Of education. Okay, creativity is not a fairness level standard. Now we haven't talked about voters, we'll talk about that in a minute. Creativity, no one ever says creativity, it's more fair. No, right? It's creativity, it's more educational, it creates unique forms of education, which is the reason why I do not like creativity specifically. Because it only operates at the level of education, and most tea debates are not one at the level of education, they are one at the level of fairness. Now that's partially because people are bad, But it's just easier to explain fairness compared to education. Because they're probably always gonna be able to say, why is talking about anything not educational? It's gonna be hard for you to argue that learning about Marx or learning about a meaning of the word bank or something is less educational than any other meaning of the word bank. But fairness is a little bit more concrete in that sense, which is strange because it is a subjective determination. But anyway, creativity, that's one thing the app says. What else do they say? Over-limiting, which ties into what? Who are they over-limiting? Who is over-limited by topicality?
Yeah.
Because remember, we talked about topicality, even though we read it against the app, it is a division of both sides' ground. And the app never gonna come up and say, actually, your interpretation doesn't give enough ground to the negative. So what do we call that standard? Afflex. An afflex is just the better explanation of creativity because it gets to what you're trying to say. It is good for the affirmative team to be able to be creative, but it has a fairness level implication that is not present when it comes to creativity. Because the idea of affirmative flexibility is there is no negative resolution. The negative is completely unconstrained by the ground that they can read in the debate. We can't read theory for the most part that says they don't get the K. They get to read picks. They get to read counterplans. They get to read disads. They get to read potentially contradictory counterplans, Ks, and disads, depending on who the judge is. They are not constrained in any way, shape, or form. However, the affirmative does have a constraint on them, which is the topic. So as long as we are within sort of the ballpark of that topic, it is good for the app to be allowed to be creative. So to give you an example, and we had a topic like this. We had a topic like this for this reason at the DVC thing. I haven't told any of you about this ahead of time, obviously, because that'd be unfair. When we were at the NPTE, my junior year, one of the topics was the United States federal government should significantly increase its naval military presence in the Gulf of Persia. And that was when a lot of stuff was going on with Iran and so on and so forth. But I got to write the app for that, and I knew something that pretty much no one else at this tournament seemed to know, which is that the United States has the two biggest hospital ships in the world. The Navy has the USS Comfort and the USS Mercy, which are basically like almost aircraft carrier size ships that can like house thousands of people, produce tens of thousands of meals, do medical supply for thousands of people. And so what was our app? We're going to send them in. We're not. And the other thing is, what's all the disads going to do? The disads are going to be when you send in a ship that upsets Iran and scares them. These ships literally have giant white and red crosses painted on them and don't have any weapons really. And so we were topical. Did we send in the Navy? Yes. Did we send them to the Persian Gulf? Yes. Did we take away the negative's ground? 100 million billion %. But it was good from an afflex perspective because we did honor the topic, right? Now, afflex ties into something we're going to talk about after this section, which is accuracy versus ground. Because basically, we were going for topicality should not be about the division of ground. Topicality should be about, are we talking about what we're supposed to talk about or not? We'll come back to that. But afflex is just better than creativity. There's no reason to ever say creativity when you can say afflex. Because again, what is our goal of standards? Standards are just internal links, as if it was a disad, to our voters of fairness and education, which are always our voters on topicality. Topicality is just a disad to not talking about the topic. So, what's the last standard the app can read? That's generally pretty good, and it's also a standard the negative reads all the time. Field context. I think field context is just the best standard in debate. You should not be reading a definition that is difficult to justify, unless you're just reading a T because you're at that level where you're trying to win time trade-offs and you think the other team sucks at T. Then it's fine. Do whatever you want. You should be reading T's because they are easy to defend. And it's easy to defend the topicality that relies on experts in the field, that is generally used in the field, that you can justify based on that. I talk about this debate all the time. I think the best T debate I ever saw was Oregon versus Rice, when the topic was about rare earth minerals, and Oregon just like beat that ass, for lack of a better word, before losing the national championship to them, the next tournament. But they beat them on like, dog, there's an organization that defines this term and also puts the elements on the periodic table using any definition, but that is actually just dumb. And what's funny is they had almost the same debate against Berkeley on this subject too. So bottom line, when you have field context, it feels really, really good, and it's really, really easy to win the debate. And it's great because it ties into education for obvious reasons. It comes from the experts in the field, but also fairness because it's inherently predictable, which brings us to the negative. The negative only really has two standards that matter, in my opinion. The first one is predictable limits. And the second one is field context. Now, why don't I just say limits? Why do I say predictable limits and not just limits? Bobby.
You only have 20 minutes to prep. You can't predict all of them.
That's a good part of it, for sure. That is a smart point there. Which ties into which one, fairness or education?
Fairness.
Yeah, a little bit of both, but mostly fairness. Why do predictable limits matter, not just limits?
Because what they read is limited, like, because they will only read a certain amount of advantages, but.
You're very
it's about
close.
whether we can.
Now, let's just make sure we're clear. Advantages have nothing to do with topicality, technically.
Yeah.
Because it's only about the plain text. But I understand what you're trying to get at. I just want to make sure for people watching this video or whatever. What if the AF comes up? You read your T. Rare earth minerals means whatever the people who made the periodic table say it means. And the AF comes up and they say rare earth minerals only means the 3 things the AF defends. Your interpretation includes 14 things. Ours includes 3 things. Ours is more limited. How would you win that debate if you're the other team who read limits and not predictable limits? The AF is more limiting than you. They meet their interpretation. Do we have thoughts on this?
I guess the AF's limits aren't predictable.
Right? So that's the term predictable. I don't know how you figure that one out. Yes. Right? Limits, why? Coming back to this question, or this sort of thesis of what topicality is. Why do we need to limit the things the affirmative can say? Like, what's the point? Why can't the affirmative just defend whatever they want every single round?
Because you don't know what they're going to defend.
Which is bad for
Fairness.
and education. What we're saying is limits is a purely negative argument. Limits is an argument about the negative's ability to prepare to debate the affirmative. And the negative can only prepare to debate the affirmative effectively if they can predict the subset of things the affirmative might defend. Because then they can do research on them in prep, they can talk to their coaches about them, they can reference back files, whatever, and they can just read disads in the round that connect, or Ks in the round that connect, whatever. Limits only matter if they're predictable. Because otherwise, the AF's just always going to beat you by being like, we're more limiting, only the AF is topical, that's our counterinterpretation, get paid. Like, what are you going to do? So we have to be able to explain that predictable limits matter. And this comes down to the thing I never, ever, 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 this is the second least common thing I ever see anyone say in a debate, that you should be always, against tricky T teams, drawing this distinction in debate. And I made a note about this, but a lot of T debate is about drawing distinctions. And T debate is different than disad debate and K debate and all this other stuff, because there's like no real warrants for the most part, right? There's no like evidence you're reading other than maybe the field context type stuff. So you have to actually be able to explain the difference of the types of debate produced in your interpretation versus the types of debates produced in the counter interpretation, and draw the distinctions between the claims about things like limits. Predictability. There are 2 kinds of predictability. And only one of them really matters. And I, again, never, ever, ever, I don't think I've literally in my entire life seen someone actually explain this in a debate to me. Which drives me crazy. And me and Dallas used to win on T all of the time. Like literally all of the time. More than any other team I've ever seen in history, we won on T. We won on T probably 50, 60 times as a team. We'd read it every single round as a negative. We'd go for it at least 50% of the time. We'd win it 90% of the time. Predictability. There is predictability of an inter versus predictability produced by an inter. What do I mean by this? What does it mean when I say predictability of an inter versus predictability produced by an inter? Can someone give me an example? Sam.
It's like you're saying that when we're in prep, there should be a predictable interpretation. But when you come to the round and you give us your interp and then you say that these are the obviously predictable things we can say after given that interp, those are two completely separate things.
Sim, that's 100% what it is. I'm going to give you a specific example, which is how I learned this concept, and it blew my mind when I heard this, because I just never really thought about it. If we have a criminal justice reform topic, and there are two interps. One comes from the Supreme Court of the United States, defining some term in the resolution. And it says there's 15 things that fall under the topic. Here are the 15 things. And we have another interp that is from Amaya's blog, and it says there's two things that fall under the topic. Amaya's interp does indeed give the negative more predictability, does indeed constrain the affirmative more, but how on earth would we know that's the interpretation? It's just some dude's blog. It is post-fact predictability. Once we know it, yeah, you're right, we know exactly which cases you'd read and what dissents would link. But that doesn't matter in prep, because whether it's a year-long debate format where we do research all year, we update our LD files and whatnot, or more importantly, Parley, where we get 20 minutes to learn about the topic and think of what our disads are and our Ks are and all of our links are and all of these things. All that matters is what could we reasonably be expected to have researched during that time in order to inform the strategy we are reading. So which one is garbage? This one is garbage. Now if you're the affirmative, go for it. Right? Because again, you're not cheating, you're not trying. But this distinction is so easy to make. We just gave you an example of it. Sim gave you the sort of more theoretical explanation of it. And I never see this made. And you know what students tell me all the time, both you folks, everyone I've coached, people in general, like the Proteus stuff or whatever? I don't like collapsing to T because it feels really hard to fill up 8 minutes about just T. Then how about do this for 30 seconds, bro? How about draw the distinction between their notion of limits and your notion of limits, and why the predictable component matters more, how limits are only about the negative's access and not the affirmative's access, how negative abuses, negative ground are more important than affirmative ground, control uniqueness, blah, 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 blah. No one ever does this. They just read their standard that they already read word for word. And then maybe, if they're kind of good, they talk about how that's best for fairness in education. But they never actually draw a distinction between the types of debate produced by their interp, the model of debate produced by their interp, and the one of the other team. It's very easy to explain this concept without even knowing the interp of why this one is better if you're the negative. And it's all the stuff we just talked about. The negative has a limited amount of time to prepare for the debate. It's crucial that the topic necessarily be limited in that same capacity, because otherwise the act's always going to be ahead of the game. You should want reasonably equitable divisions of ground because that's most fair to teams. If there is a bias for the affirmative because they have way more ground than the negative, and there's unpredictable ground for the negative, then the affirmative is going to win more debates regardless of their actual skill level. And then instead of evaluating how good debaters debated, we're evaluating how dumb topic writers are. That's why I tell you those topics, and what do I tell you in IPDA? If you're the negative and there's a topic that says something like, we should help the homeless, just strike that shit. Why? Because there's a million ways to do that and you were going to lose the debate. It's a good idea and there's a million good ideas they can pick. But if it says, we should help the homeless by locking them in cages or something silly, it's like, well, there's only one thing they can do and that one sounds pretty bad. Good topic for the negative, awful topic for the affirmative. Predictability of versus predictability produced by an inter. Questions on that? Because this is a really important concept to understand. And that most judges, they don't even know this. They haven't even thought of this. And when you explain this to them, they're going to go, oh, yeah, I guess when they said their interp was more limiting, that was stupid. And not actually an argument. Michelle.
Could you do an example helpful if you like saying this in a speech.
I kind of just did, but yes.
Okay.
Right. So let's go ahead and do it. Now let's just do it. So let's pretend it's criminal justice. Let's pretend it's the examples we gave you: Supreme Court definition versus random dude's blog definition. So we get to the predictability of it. You should always prioritize the predictability of an interpretation as opposed to the predictability produced by an interpretation. Their interpretation would have been really fair if we could have guessed it in prep time, but absent our ability to do so because it's from some random dude's blog, you can't prefer it to the most predictable interpretation possible coming from the highest court in the land. When you think criminal justice, you do not think Amaya's blog at AOL.com or whatever. You think SCOTUS of the United States federal government. The question of predictability is tied to fairness in education. The negative only has so much time to research for this debate and must pick the most effective link arguments possible. Yes, their interpretation, if we knew it, would have given us the most specific links, but if we can't think of those links because we can't guess what they're going to do, we're having to make everything up on the fly, and they get a 20-minute time advantage on us in prep. We don't get to talk to our coaches about their new app. We don't get to talk to the internet about their new app. We just have to come up with it off the top of our heads. That is an unfair burden for us. That is bad for education. When debate doesn't have education, it becomes a monologue, not a dialogue. Clash is the only unique benefit and the only unique form of education produced in this space, and only a predictability of predictable limits establishes that. Whatever, I talked about it. And that's how I won team debates. Anyway, so. Any other questions about this, because we're moving to the next important concept? Great. Now this is something that I do occasionally hear people say, but still not enough. And this is actually kind of, arguably, research-based. The NPDA used to have a journal where you could publish articles about debate. And the most successful debate coach of all time, Todd Graham from SIU, who Steve Winning coached for, when he coached Josh and Mike when they won nationals and all that stuff, wrote a paper about conditionality and about topicality, 2 separate papers. And one about topicality talked about how he says people are wrong. Because what most people think topicality is about is this. Most people think topicality is about ground. But Todd Graham argued topicality is not about ground, it's about what?
The topic?
Actually, yes, but that's not the way he put it.
Accuracy?
Accuracy. Which I can kind of spell. Accuracy. What is the difference between these two things? If I'm saying that I'm reading topicality as a question of accuracy, not ground, what am I saying?
Like, it's not your fault if the resolution was made one-sided or the other.
Do either team in the debate pick the resolution?
No.
How is it my fault that the topic writers wrote a resolution where the actual definitions of these terms, the most widely, most effective, most field contextual definition of these terms, screws over the negative? Why is that my problem? I'm doing my job. The burden of the affirmative is to prove the resolution true. It is not to make sure the negative has a super fun time and gets to participate in the discussion and gets all the sickest diss-ad links. It is purely to prove the topic true. And there's a problem. There's a sort of philosophical, logical problem with understanding topicality as a question of ground. I'm going to pause here for a second. You should assume topicality is a question of ground. Why should you assume topicality is a question of ground, even though, truthfully, I don't think it is? Why should you assume that? Because all your goddamn judges do. And so, we adapt. But this is the secret sauce. If there was one thing that made me and Dallas win debates on topicality, it was this. Because I've never seen a team that wasn't from Pacific or SIU ever explain this. Go ahead, Amaya.
Can you go for accuracy as the negative?
You almost never want to, but you theoretically could. I've never seen it really make a ton of sense in a debate. I've done it like once or twice. But that was just because they had a pretty good ground argument, and well, that's not what topicality is about. Now is it, big boy? Accuracy versus ground. What is the problem? If we take the assumption that topicality is about ground to its logical extreme, and if we take the assumption that it's not ground for the app that we care about, it's ground for the negative, what is the best interpretation of every resolution?
Webster's?
That was a good joke, Bobby. No, not the one with the most clash. Not the one, kind of the one with the most ground, but not really. Topicality is not about af ground really, it's about neg ground. Technically, like negative is saying we are at a ground disadvantage. You have taken our ground, you've taken more ground than you can. From the negative's perspective, what's the best interpretation for the affirmative to have to defend always? That there's only how many topical plans? One. The best thing for the negative is always that the AF only has one option. Why is that best for the negative? Because they know what their links are going to be. If there's only one topical affirmative, the negative always links. That's why in my COM 123 classes, I make it so that the resolution for policy debate only has one possible topical AF. Okay? The problem with the ground understanding of topicality is the best interpretation every single round is the AF must do only this. Even if everyone disagrees, even if the evidence says otherwise, even if the person who invented that goddamn word says otherwise. The guy who invented Cheez-Its tells you the definition of Cheez-It is this thing. That is worse under the ground understanding of topicality than Cheez-Its mean this one very specific thing that doesn't give the AF very much ground and gives a ton to the negative. Todd Graham argues, and a lot of older policy people back in the day argued, topicality is not about that. The only question of topicality is the affirmative and is the negative talking about the thing they were meant to talk about? And the way this used to get explained was through a standard that everyone hates called framers intent. And the way this shakes out in every debate I've seen over the last 10 years is framers intent. The framers wanted you to talk about this. And then the other team goes, did you ask the framers if they wanted to talk about this? And they go, well, no. And then they go, well, that was stupid, huh? Right? And this kind of happened in one of the DVC debates, right? Because they're like, well, Paul, blah, 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 like in the finals or whatever, one of your rounds, they talked about, we know your coach and he did this thing and whatever, right? They're kind of going for this like framers intent understanding of what topicality is because the resolution was about topicality, right? Accuracy versus ground. What I want to explain is this. The negative is 99% of the time arguing topicality is about ground. And the AF also is 99% of the time. But if you know you're hosed on ground as the affirmative, you can always retreat to accuracy and try and convince the judge topicality has nothing to do with ground. The negative and the AF don't give ground. The resolution does. And this resolution most accurately can be understood as this. Now when you're doing that, do you think you're going for AF flexibility or field context?
Field context.
Field context. The only way to win accuracy is to go for field context. You can't win it without field context. But that's good because that means you have evidence, bro. It means you're not just making stuff up. You can argue why your source is the best. We don't do a lot of this in debate. We don't have a lot of discussions about like Harvard's a better source than Yale or my blog or whatever. But we should, on topicality specifically. In a diss ad, no one even, you could just make up your words. Every single, CNN and New York Times say this, then whatever, who cares? Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. First one is, how do we know if one thing's field context is better than the other if they're both like really reputable?
That's a great question. I would say that there's not a like true objective answer to that question, and it comes down to the debate. But you have to have a justification. So in LD, what do? Like the really good schools, what do? Do they just give you the author? No, they give you the author's quals. Right? They tell you this author is a senior fellow at this institute that does research on blah, 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 blah. This comes from the defining work that explained this term in the most important court case, whatever, blah, 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 right? You've got to be able to do that work on your own. You shouldn't be picking interps that you're not ready to defend. Same thing with the AF. Why do teams on the AF lose to the K all the time? Because they're just not ready to defend that the AF's a good idea, bro. They're not willing to say, no, but probably, I know the state kind of sucks, I guess, but it'd be cool if they, didn't kill poor people as much. Wouldn't that be nice? Here's how we can do that. Mm-hmm.
And the second one is, can you go for accuracy if you go for common usage?
I mean, you could, but I would not be reading common usage. I would literally limit your standards to the ones we just talked about. If you're the negative, you can read predictable limits and field context. If you're the AF, affirmative flexibility and field context. let me make a note. At State and FIRO, you read common person all you want. What I'm telling you is that a sort of national circuit, like experienced debate critic, does not give a shit about common usage. Like, I understand that it's a pretty good predictability argument, but like the other team's gonna come up and go, why do we care how the common person defines these terms? We're talking about like geopolitics. The common person doesn't know a goddamn thing about Uganda. Like, whatever. But State and FIRO, I love that, right? Dictionary definition, that's my standard. Love that for you. Okay, we're coming close. So, answers to topicality. What are my answers to topicality? We meet, or impossible to meet. Counterinterpretation. We meet the counterinterpretation. Ours is good.
Yours bad.
Yours is bad.
Don't vote, potential abuse.
Don't vote potential abuse.
Reasonability.
Reasonability. So, we're going to talk about how do you answer T before we talk about what most of you actually need to work on, which is how do you go for T. Because you need to know how are they going to answer it, or how should they answer it, before you know how will you know to go for it or not. So, what is a we meet?
It's an argument saying that whatever the interpretation the other team read, you meet it, or like your app.
You're right. You're good. So, earlier I said topicality is a disad, essentially to the negative not being able to prepare for the debate. So what is a we meet?
Non-unique.
No.
No.
It's a no link.
Okay.
A we meet is a no link because the violation is the link to the interpretation. So we meet is a no link. If you no link a disad, are you good? Like if you really have a no link on a disad, which you're good.
Yeah.
Debate's over
Yeah.
on the disad links. Debate's over on the T. Okay? Impossible to meet.
That's enough.
That's essentially like a 90-day or like a what's like it's almost like a what? Like right? It's like what are we doing, bro? I don't know what that means. Okay. This just makes sense. If you read a counterinterpretation, you should be reading a we meet the counterinterpretation. But in this sort of metaphor of topicality being a disad, what is a counterinterpretation?
A link term?
No. But that's a really good guess.
Impact term?
It's a counterplan.
Oh.
The reason we read a counterplan in disad debate is to generate uniqueness, right? To be able to solve for the offense of the affirmative team. You read a counterplan either to read an advantage counterplan, don't worry about that, or to steal the AF's ground. Because your disad's not that good, but if you steal part of the AF, you start to outweigh. Why do we read a counterinterpretation?
To steal parts of the.
To steal what parts?
The standards.
The standards. To steal their internal links to fairness and education. That's why we read a counterinterpretation. Which crucially means something very, very important. Your counterinterpretation is giga dog shit if it does not either function as an advantage counterplan, meaning it gives you big access to standards they can't access and hopefully outweigh theirs, or better, lets you access their standards. So that comes back to kind of something you said earlier, Maya. Like, what do we do if this field context versus field context debate? That's good if you did that. You should be having a field context versus field context debate because you should be trying to steal field context from them. You should be trying to steal affirmative flexibility from them or predictable limits from them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, R is good. What does that mean?
It just
Why
wants to confirm the counterplan.
Why our interpretation is good? Yes, of course that's what that sentence means. What does it mean for our interpretation to be good? What does a good interpretation do? How do we measure that an interpretation is good?
Through standards.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the standards are as good. But specifically, when we say our interp is good, we are saying something about our interp. And I want this to be clear, and this is in the notes. Standards, reasons to prefer, mean the same thing, are and all should be derived from the types of debate produced by your interpretation. The point of reading an interpretation as the negative and the affirmative is to say, if we were to do debate under this model, we would have desirable debates. Debate would look the way we want debate to look. So to say ours is good is to say certain kinds of debates happen, or certain things happen in debates when you use our interp instead of theirs. Similarly, yours is bad. Their interp is bad because it allows certain things that aren't good. And those things, again, tie to fairness in education. Now, there's something we kind of want to include within this that I've been less specific about because you don't necessarily need this, but it's good to have from the opposite side, which is, when we read T, we do interpretation, violation, limits, or predictable limits, field context, a priori, fairness, education. Maybe you say competing interpretations if you're feeling like it. But a sneaky thing to put in your T-shell that we don't do enough, but we do kind of do in LD, is you should have an argument, a spike, about why their model of debate / their interpretation, even though you don't know their interpretation ahead of time, technically, is not reasonable. Because we know they're going to try and retreat to reasonability. The affirmative team has zero incentive to ever evaluate the debate through competing interpretations, even if their interpret is bad. So it's good to have something that says, like, this understanding of it is unreasonable, is bad, is beyond the pale. Okay? Great. Don't vote on potential abuse. Oh, I'll get you one second, man. Don't vote on potential abuse. Explanation for this. Well, one, we already said what potential abuse is. Explanation for this, it's like voting on a potential dissent. Why would you punish us because we could have cheated and did it? Doesn't that make us good? Isn't it like really like morally good that we could have cheated and didn't? What was your question, man?
It was on the thing about the counter interps, about how they're kind of like counter plans. But in that same case, is it strategic to read counter interps that are kind of like picks, which would be like, oh, their interp plus our half?
There's a reason that's bad, and we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
In fact, we kind of already have talked about it without doing it, but you are right that that is why people do that, because they're trying to steal the ground. But there's a reason that specifically is wrong. CTO.
Okay.
I'll come back to that in just one second, because that's actually the next thing I was going to talk about. Reasonability. Okay.
I just have one other
Go ahead.
question.
But remember that note, please, because I might forget it. But go ahead.
Gotcha. Is it possible for the affirmative to perm the negative?
That is what they are trying to do when they read those awful plus interps.
Could the negative perm their plus interp?
That kind of does happen sometimes. We'll explain it. That is what happens when the affirmative reads an interp that is not competitive with the negative, which happens way more often than it should.
Okay.
People read interps that are like this, and you're like, that can happen under our interp. You don't solve any of the offense. GG. Happens at high level T debates all the time. Sick.
So in the terms of how the perm functions, I guess for T, it's more of a test of competition.
That's all it is, yeah.
Okay.
Is your interp competitive? Because T, it is a test of competition. Okay. Yeah, we're coming together. Reasonability. What's the best way to win reasonability?
Like you explained that even if you were topical, the judge would have to vote you down.
You're skipping a really important step. Now that is good. You want to know what the best way to win reasonability is? Be fucking reasonable. Why do we almost never, in like the 2 years I've been coaching here, 3 years I guess now, geez, it's been a long time. Why do we like almost never lose to T in LD or in Parley? Happens a little more in LD because LD is weird. But why do we almost never, I can't even think of a time we lost to T in Parley that wasn't like, we just shit the bed.
Because we don't make stupid plans.
We're always topical, bro! Why don't you don't lose to T? Be topical and then explain how you were reasonably topical. Why your interpretation is reasonable. What does reasonable mean? The problem is, and this is how teams beat you, they think you're not going to explain what reasonability means, or that it's arbitrary or whatever, and that's why competing interpretations is better. You need to have a defense of what it means to be reasonable. And you can have an abusive one. That's what Berkeley used to do, and it was smart. They used to be like, and give us reasonability if we win any defense against their standards or any offensive counter standard, we're reasonably topical. And the other team never answered that, and then they won one standard, and they went, we told you how you should evaluate this. This is how you're going to do it. Now we win. We don't have to answer all the standards. I don't even care if we dropped all of them. They conceded that if we win one, we win the debate. We win the debate. Now, there's also the explanation that I prefer. I don't know if critics do, but we don't lose on T, so who fucking knows? Which is, the problem with competing interpretations, which is the other way of evaluating topicality and theory in general, and competing interpretations is the idea that, like, it's the flow is God, and you're a robot, now do your job, robot, and add everything up and tell us who wins. The problem with that is, you can lose even if you're topical, which is stupid, right? Under reasonability, if we are topical, we shouldn't lose the debate. If you thought we were topical after the 1AC, why would you let them change your mind now? Like, if you heard our speech and went, yeah, that's what I expect this debate to be about, and then they go, well, that's stupid and dumb, why would you be like, I got it right? Now, people say, I'll get to you in a second, that's judge intervention. That's your job, homie. Your job is to evaluate the debate. That's why you have a judge philosophy, to intervene. Now, your judge philosophy can be, I just let the kids play, that's fine. But it's silly. The idea that judge intervention is not inevitable and in large cases good is ridiculous. Most of the time when people talk about judge intervention, the way they say it is like, here's the deal. If you vote on reasonability, the racists win. Like, actually, this is actually the argument. The argument is like, then bigots will do bigoted stuff. Sexist people will do sexist stuff. Racist people will do racist stuff. But now that we told you, you won't. I know you're a racist, Sin, but just pretend you aren't because you care more about the flow than racism. Like, that's stupid. It makes no sense, right? Judge intervention is nonsense. Amelia, what was your question before we move on? I'm trying to wrap this up. Sorry, it's been going for a long time. It sounds a lot of thoughts.
So in that case, does reasonability, like, I guess not having a bright line, or like kind of impact turn the idea of there should be a bright line?
Yeah.
Okay, and in that case.
And so what's the argument that they usually make? Limits. Limits is just fundamentally a bright line argument. Yeah. Right? And so reasonability is going for limits as a stupid way of understanding this. Mm-hmm. If you thought we're topical, we're topical.
So in that case, if we were to read this in like a debate, would we need to have like a point underneath reasonability that's like, oh, because it allows the negation to read frivolous T arguments?
You can have that kind of thing. I don't think that's necessary in the MG, because the MG is very time pressed, and it's difficult for me to imagine a world where when you've said reasonability is good, they come up and say competing interpretation and explain why it's bad. You as the PMR don't get to answer that.
I see.
Right now, technically there is a world where maybe some judge like, well, you didn't say it, so go ahead if you want to, but it's a time trade-off, right? Now it's only 3 seconds. 3 seconds could matter in the end. So it's up to you. I used to tell people, I don't even think you need to say competing interpretations as the negative. The judge probably knows the score. Some people think you should. Again, to me, it's like that's 7 seconds I didn't have to waste because everyone knew the score. Okay, we're moving on. Reasonability. That thing I told you to remind me of, what was it?
It was the counterplan, or the counterinterp is the inter plus the out.
So what does tricky, this is very Berkeley, and it worked for Berkeley for a long time, and it's still working for Berkeley. So shout out to Berkeley, this was brilliant. It pulled the wool over everyone's eyes for years. The interps that Berkeley would read, I don't know where they got them from, but it just crushed, still crushes, was your interp plus their AF when they would read a K. You'd read long form framework and say you must defend the topic and fiat and consequences, and they'd say you must do that or read our AF. And their argument would be, what is the difference on limits here? We allow one thing that their interp doesn't. What is the actual abuse from literally one more AF you have to prepare for? And what is the answer to that question? We've already addressed it.
The fact that it's not predictable.
Predictability of versus predictability produced by. All of our standards are reasons why things need to be predictable in prep, not once we get to the round, bro. This post-fact predictability doesn't do anything for us. You're right. If we knew exactly what you were going to read, we would have read good answers to it. But we didn't. And we couldn't have based on the topic, which was the only thing we were given before the round. Okay, so let's start wrapping up. The affirmative should be saying all of these things. Yes, Bobby?
How do you say that, like, we meet their counter-interpretation and then say it's bad?
That's fine, doesn't matter. They can't go, it doesn't work the way it does with like a counterplan with like Kondo, where like they're like, well then you meet our interpretation, that's bad, that's an impact turn and you lose. Like, it doesn't work that way. Just don't worry about it. We meet their interpretation, and their interpretation is stupid. It was a stupid interp, but sure, we meet it.
When you say your interpretation plus their app,
So let's pretend my interpretation, Michelle, was the Supreme Court one. My interpretation is there's only 3 topical AFs: buying ice cream, buying cookies, and buying candy. And then they come up and say counter interpretation: buying cookies, buying candy, buying ice cream, and settler colonialism. Their argument is, well, look, we're only one more thing. It's just one more thing. What's the difference? And under our interp, as long as you knew that interp, you know what to prepare for. But the problem is, we didn't know your interp.
I thought interp was an interpretation of a word in the resolution. So I'm confused what you mean.
So their interpretation is that the word criminal justice reform means laws, this is on the negative, means laws protecting ice cream, candy, and cookies.
Okay.
Their counter interpretation is it means laws, candy, cookie, ice cream, and settler colonialism.
Okay.
Now the problem is, a lot of times, Michelle, you're right, that T mostly, it should be a matter of competing definitions for words. But in K-debate, but in K-debate, man, they kind of throw that out because they don't care about the topic, and they're just going for the models of debate idea that, well, forget the resolution. It's just about what debate should look like. Okay, back to this. How do we know we should go for T? On the easiest level.
Or winning.
How do we know we're winning? You're correct. How do we know we're winning? That's actually the hardest level, technically. But how would we know we're winning cheat sheet version?
If the app messes up in making those responses or doesn't make it.
How many of these can they miss, and then we feel confident that T's a wrap? I think if they miss 3, it's over. I legit think if a team misses 3 of these, it is you should just win the debate, and it's silly if you don't. Any 3 of them. If they miss 4, there's just no excuse unless your judge told you they hate T for you not to go for it. Now, if they miss 2, it's doable. Because the truth is, if you're very good, it's doable if they do all 7. But you should only do it if you know you're going to lose, right? Now, this is the problem. I just asked you, how do we know to go for T? They missed 3 or more of these, okay, on average. So when would you be making that decision to go for T?
The beginning.
As soon as they answer.
Like 90 seconds into the MG. The second they're done with topicality, you would know if they missed 3 or more, and you would go, we're going for T. You would tell your partner to keep flowing their speech, and you would start spending the next 6 minutes of their speech prepping T. And then the extra minute you get after that of flex time. And then you get 7 minutes to write out how you're going for T, and you triple point everything they said, and you have these good explanations. So you make sure you fill your time. But the problem is, me too in a second, when they answer all of it, when do you have to decide to go for T? Pretty much the end of their speech. Which sucks, because then you have 1 minute to figure it out. I don't usually recommend going for T against a team that made these answers. Because even if we are technically correct, and could, if we were very good, explain it, it's an uphill battle. The only reason you should do that is if you were going to lose the debate. Okay? Because most judges don't want to vote on T. Even if you're with, bro, again, there's like 20% of judges that even if the other team gets to your topicality and goes on topicality, they're still voting for that team. Because they just think T is stupid. So why make it hard for yourself? Okay. How do we go for T?
Extend the interp, 1 violation, pick 1 standard to collapse to, explain why outweighs, and then collapse to the voter.
Yeah, basically, right? Well, that's like the most simplified explanation. But let's take a step back. Topicality is a disad. We're going to talk about topicality as a disad. How do you go for a disad? What do you need to win a disad?
Outweighs.
You need a uniqueness argument, a link argument. Technically, no, you need an internally, it's a little dicey. But yeah, you should. And then an impact. Okay? You should think of topicality exactly the same. When your uniqueness, which is your interpretation, Win a link. Win a link. Win a link. Because a lot of people just assume they have one. Win your violation. Be very clear. This is the drawing distinctions moment. Why is there we meet garbage? Because they're going to make a we meet. Steve used to say this. Steve still says this. There's a million shitty we meets in the world. And there's no reason for the app not to make one, because if you don't answer it, they win. It takes them 2 seconds. There's 0 opportunity cost. They're going to make it. Some teams will read 10 we meets and just hope you don't answer one of them. It's annoying. And we'll talk about how to deal with that in a second. Great. Standards. You're the negative. What are your standards?
Predictability, limits, field.
Predictable, not predictability and limits, predictable limits in field context. Which one do you want to be going for? Field context ideal. But you should be able to explain predictability. The reason you want to go for field context, way easier to explain. Ties into education and fairness really easily. So you already know what standards you're going for. One of those 2 things. So what does it mean that you know every single debate you will be going for one of 2 standards on T? What does it mean? What do K debaters do that makes them so busted in parlay?
They know everything before the round.
They know what they're going to say before the round because they read the same thing every goddamn round. There's a video of Amanda Mescal, who's like one of the best parlay debaters of all time, won 1 billion national championships. And I like transcribed it. And it's 2 different rounds of 2 different tournaments where they make like 30 arguments in both speeches and 28 of them are the same. Word for word the same. Because they know all the possible options. They know the decision tree. You know you're going for predictable limits and have to get to fairness or education. You know you're going for field context and have to get to fairness or education. You can treat this like Lincoln-Douglas debate and write out and practice your collapse 20 times in an hour. And you'll have gone for T more than anyone in the country is going to go for it this year in 1 day of practice. I'm not kidding. This is what I used to do all the time. You should know your blocks for when you asked me to explain the thing earlier, that's just stuff that I used to say all the time. Right? Predictability and limits, here's why. Here's why it ties to fairness, here's why it ties to education. Here's why fairness matters more than education, here's why education matters more than fairness, here's why field context matters more. The only trick is, one of your subpoints needs to be like a subpoint, brackets. And the brackets is where you would insert the topic-specific stuff or why your source specifically is good. And everything else can be a script. And you'll win 9 out of 10 T debates because other people won't even do that. And they're just going to read their MG block, and MG blocks on T are dog shit. And they all look exactly the same. Except for if you're right or something, you add an RVI, and then I go, why are you doing this to me? Okay? So are there any questions about this? That is how you go for T. You write blocks. That is the actionable answer. Until you are God tier, you write blocks. Now let me ask you a question. Have any of you written your T blocks?
No.
Not one of you. Maybe Emily, kind of a little bit. More.
I know.
More. Better. Have them all. And your partner needs to know your T block so that when they come up in the LOR, they can go, Emily crushed it on fairness. 3 arguments she makes. Blah, blah, and blah. Etc., etc. That is how you go for it. Then you get to fairness. So what you need to win T, it's a disad. You need uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. But there's one thing we haven't discussed, and I'm not going to discuss it for more than 5 seconds. If you're the negative, you need to win competing interpretations. And that is like winning framework on a K. It's like winning net benefits on a policy case. If you don't win that, you're not going to win the debate. The app will always win reasonability. I've almost never seen a judge go, actually, I voted neg on reasonability. I just thought the app wasn't super reasonable. I voted for them. Never happens. So, here's the entirety of an MO on T, as brief as I can, and then we're wrapping this up. Overview on top. You are voting on topicality because it is a gateway issue in this debate. The fairness for the negative and our ability to engage with them has been terminally skewed, which has skewed your evaluation of the flow. Go to topicality now. Interpretation. First, extend our interpretation, blah, 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 blah. Why it's really, really good is going to come on the standards debate, but go to the violation level. They say we meet. There's 3 reasons they don't meet. Blah, 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 blah. They say impossible to meet. Duh, it's not impossible to meet. Here's a TVA for you, bro. It's not that hard to come up with it, etc., 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 etc. Win a violation clearly. Standards. At the point where they undercover and or concede predictable limits, the debate is over. The question of predictability shouldn't be if we knew their interp doesn't limit the debate. The question should be, could we know their interp ahead of time and prepare for it? Because if the negative can't predict the interpretation of the affirmative, then they can't get effective access to links which further skews the debate, which hurts both education and fairness. We'll start with the fairness debate, blah, 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 and then somewhere in here you answer their standards and you win the debate. Lastly, on competing interpretations versus reasonability. Do not give them reasonability. It's fundamentally arbitrary. It allows judge intervention. You shouldn't be picking who wins based on your thoughts on topicality. You should be letting the debaters decide that. If RT argument is stupid and easy to respond to, why didn't they do it? Competing interpretation is the only fair thing. You flow this debate for a reason. If you don't trust your flow, you shouldn't be in the judging poll. Vote for the negative. Boom. T. And it has to be just that angry. Almost. I'm almost not kidding, right? Because topicality does not seem persuasive on its own. But if you do that shit and you're just like, blah, 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 like big actor, you know, you're probably going to win. So that's my lecture on topicality. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off. Shout out Proteus Debate. Because I think Rob needs this desperately.